She quit me.
Like, am I always going to be a failure?
I cried yesterday. You're not good at cooking. That's definitely not one of your gifts.
We're still in the works. We're still figuring it out, right? Please
Subscribe.
subscribe, Mom.
What do you do when you feel like you don't have purpose? My name's Josh.
And my name's Hayden.
And this is Figuring It Out with the Pontons, the podcast where, well, we figure it out. And this is where we talk about how we do life,
marriage,
business,
family,
ministry, and so much more while trying to keep Christ at the center of it all. So let's hop in. So today's podcast, we are coming at you guys. We're going to be talking about what it looks like to just find your purpose. What happens if you don't have it? What happens if your spouse doesn't have their purpose while maybe you feel like you're on fire? Or what happens when you both find yourself in situations where it feels like, what the heck are we doing and why are we even doing it? I feel like we just literally had a conversation about that of like, hey, are we doing too many things? Why are we doing this? Like, where's our time? It feels like we've been, burning on both ends. How do you say that saying? Burning both candles or whatever it is. Burning the candle on both ends.
There you go.
The last few days. And sometimes that creates overwhelm. And sometimes it's a little bit deeper than that. Sometimes it's long seasons of feeling like you don't have purpose, feel like you don't know if you're doing the right thing, are you in the right career, are we connecting, just all of those different things. And then you add in failures that happen along the way to it. And I feel like you can have a pretty messy situation. So let's hop into the conversation and let's figure it out.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to start with the definition of purpose. Purpose is the reason for which something is done or created, or for which something exists. And so that's your, average dictionary definition. But it all starts with Christ. And it's where we were made by God. And until we understand that we were made by God for a purpose, we're never actually going to understand our purpose. So I think it's like super important that we start with saying, okay, purpose is the reason for why we're here. But the reason why we're here is created by God.
Yeah. And I think that's when things really pivoted for us, is when we start to actually realize of like, where should we be keeping its focus on? Because I think what happens, and we'll kind of dive into the story of Joseph. I think that's a great story of like purpose, and how he got his identity at first in a vision, but like it didn't really come to full for like a whole decade. And even then it still wasn't like this big clear thing. Like, you had to figure it out as it was going. And so I think what's going to happen in life for most of us is like, you're never going to have your plan completely laid out for you. You're always going to be taking it one step at a time. And what I've noticed is that God doesn't really reveal the entire plan to you. It's just like the smallest glimpse of like, oh, maybe I should do that, or I feel called here. And we don't get the whole thing laid out for us. And I think what helps deal with that, or at least for me, it's been like going to the book of James. And in there, he talks about how like your life is just a vapor. And it can be like this very depressing quote if you think about it, because essentially just saying like your life means nothing. But that's not what he's saying, right? Like, what he is saying is that life is like a vapor compared to eternity. And that what that means is that if we actually keep eternity into our focus, and we understand that is our big purpose, where our purpose is to run the race to get to eternity and build our life for eternity, then really all the other things that we decide to do, whether that's what you work, what you drive, what you go, like how much money you make, all those different things don't really matter when you actually compare it to eternity. So it kind of helps. It doesn't really take away the problem of like, hey, what do I do right now?
Yeah.
But I think it takes off the stress of thinking that we have to figure it all out and know exactly where we're heading, or our 10-year plan. Because really, what really matters is, what does it look like to keep eternity into the picture?
Yeah, that's good. I think it's almost like it takes practice in a sense.
Yeah.
It's like a weird way to put it, but you gotta just practice different things until you get that you start seeing and you see the Lord revealing what your purpose is going to be. I really had to shift my perspective on that, because for me, I just bounce around from so many different things thinking like, oh, this next thing's it. Like, this is what God's going to call me to do. But through each one of them, it may have been, I might have felt like a failure, but in each one of them, I got one step closer to seeing the Lord reveal, okay, this is what he has in store for me. But I couldn't, fully understand that until I understood the fact that I am made by God for the purpose of God and to further his kingdom. And when that was my foundation, it was like, okay, we can figure this out. Because I can't figure it out on my own. I have to use Christ.
Yeah, I think let's label that and define it of, for people listening, then it's what does that look like then to understand what the real purpose is? Right.
Mm.
So if we're saying the real purpose is we're made for God, that sounds beautiful. We should put that on like a quote somewhere, like I guess like your kitchen. But like, what does that actually mean?
That means faith. That means that it takes dying daily to the cross and to have that intimate relationship with the Lord. So I think it starts with what's your foundation? And I think it starts with, do you have an intimate relationship with the Lord?
Yeah.
Are you seeking Him? Are you learning His word? Are you understanding? Because the funny thing is, the Bible's purpose is it's a guide for us, but we don't look at it that way. And, if you want to talk about failures, go read about Peter. And I think that's the thing that we forget is like, yes, the scene may have been different then, but it applies perfectly to where we are today. So I think when we're diving into His word and understanding His word, then we're able to be on the other side of it, right? Then we can have that quote in a sense of what it might feel good or seem to be good, but it's like, no, it's because we're actually following His ways because we're learning what they're supposed to be.
Yeah, I think it's making him a priority because that's the
Yeah.
biggest thing. It's, God doesn't really care what your career is, right? It's like you can have the best day ever at work. You can
Mm-hmm.
crush it. You can come home, you can, get the kiss from the wife and like all of those things can go perfect. But if you spent zero quality time being intimate with God, I feel like it's still not a good day in his eyes. Right.
Yeah.
And then you could have the opposite of that where and we've experienced this before where it feels like everything else is going wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You know, something bad happened in the business, something's going on with the kids, right? We're, fighting or something like that. But if there was still that intentionality and that time with God and like going towards Him and like you said, like laying it all down, like dying daily, you would still classify that as a good day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like where it starts. Because if you can start there, then I think we can now go a little bit further and build upon that. Because I don't think God just calls us to literally do nothing, right? Actually, it's the opposite of that.
Yeah.
But I think there's that foundation first, which is the foundation is, do you actually know and love God?
Mm-hmm.
And then I think when you move past that and we look at, okay, cool, what's our purpose in God? That's the first part is obviously He wants us to be saved. And so
Mm-hmm.
for us, we believe that our salvation comes through the cross,
Mm-hmm.
through what Christ sacrificed for us. But then there's a flip side of it, right? Because Jesus gives two ultimate commandments, right? Know and love Him. It's others, right? It's ministry. It's going out and making sure that we are furthering His kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if those two things are happening, it doesn't matter what else you choose to do. Those are two things that are ultimately like what a Christian is called to,
Yeah.
right? To know and love God and then further His kingdom, right?
Yeah.
And furthering His kingdom, what does that mean? It means living a life that shows other people Him and bringing other people to Him,
Yeah.
right? It's that's our purpose. That's what we're called to. And I think once you have that, at least for us, like once we've realized that and we've like put that into play, it makes dealing with the other things a lot easier, but it's still tough, right?
Yeah.
Like you just recently went through a season where I guess if we want to tell the story of you quitting my company, that was fun. She quit me. She literally quit my company. You knew God,
Yeah.
right? Like we were living that life or living the life, right? Those things were there, but it was still a really hard season because it was almost a year of you trying to figure out like what are you going to do next.
Yeah. And I think it was a harder season too, though, because yes, I knew about God and I've been a Christian for a long time but in that season of like feeling like I didn't have a purpose, I didn't deeply know the Lord. I wasn't seeking the Lord in that struggle. I was just giving up and like, I have no purpose. I'm a failure. Like, am I always going to be a failure? And so I think that in that season prior to that, I'm just like, I'm a failure. I'm never going to get out of it. But the difference is when I did quit your company was the fact that I was seeking the Lord through it. And it was like, okay, I can grieve in that moment of like, I feel like a failure for a second. But then I'm like, okay, how am I going to pursue the Lord in this? Like, how
Yeah.
am I going to seek Him to find His purpose? Because then after you seek Him and you say, okay, Lord, I'm laying this down for you, and you go humbly to Him, then you go to your community. then you're going to go to people and you're going to say like, okay, here's where I'm at. Here's what I'm feeling. Here's where I'm struggling. Like, gather with me, right? Like, the Lord intended community for a reason. He gathered his 12 disciples. He had his community to lift each other up, to challenge each other, and to better one another. And so it's like you go to your community and then you pray and then you have that intimate relationship with the Lord and you seek him. So that way, when you do feel like a failure, where you feel like, I just don't understand my purpose, it's like it makes that weight so much lighter. It might be confusing and there's still, it's going to be hurt in the process, but it makes that burden so much lighter.
Yeah, and I think it's okay to seek it because,
Yeah.
in the New Testament, you'll see like Christ calls us builders, which is so interesting. But he talks about like we are here to build, right? We're here to not. But a lot of times, I feel like it's mistaken with ministry. That means like you're here to build the church, and so that means like, you have to go to ministry or things like that. But it's like that's not the case of it. It's just like there is a purpose that God already has planned for what things are going to look like, and we are His workers.
Yeah.
It was kind of like when you do, if you build a custom home, the person who is actually designing the custom home is not the person building it, right? Usually they're building, using subcontractors, like they're using builders to do the work. And that's what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to build.
Yeah.
And I think we find this despair, and it's a good thing that we feel that way when we feel like we're not building, right? When we're not building something or we're not using our hands, not like physically using our hands, but when we're not actually building what Christ is calling us to build, I think that's when we start to feel lost and we start to feel confused and we start to like then, resent things or get upset and like all this, like just this frustration comes out because we're not being used for what we're supposed to, right? It's like, it's a wasted tool in a sense.
Yeah. But God wants to grow us into our purpose if we let him.
Yeah.
But we can't sit and, right, there's action to be taken, but you can't sit and just plan everything on your own and expect it to go great. Because he longs for us to grow in him and seek him to then grow into that purpose. But we forget that part and we just say like, oh, I got this. But you don't. There's no way. You're always, that failure or the trials are going to hurt 10 times worse because you're not in the Lord.
Yeah. So how do you start? I guess even before we talk about like, okay, cool, what do you do to go find your purpose? I think you give some great tips there, right? Of like, first off, it's seeking Christ first, and then it's prayer, then it's community. And like, I think in those things, you start to figure it out, right? Like someone usually whispers something, you get this inclination, I mean, I don't hear things, but sometimes people, you hear something from the Holy Spirit of, hey, this is what you're supposed to do next. I think where I was going with that is just like, okay, are we supposed to do something big? Like what does it look like? And, so random, but I cried yesterday in the bathroom, but it was because I watched this video. I'm going somewhere.
I didn't know this.
I watched this video and it was really, really powerful. And so to kind of line it up, there's a judgment day even for Christians.
Yeah.
It is in the New Testament, it's biblical that there is going to be a judgment day. Now, I want to be super clear that because we have the cross and because Christ died for our sins, our judgment day is not to deal with do we go to hell or not. That's already been answered. But there's a judgment day that's going to be decided on the talents that you were given, right? The gifts that you got from God. What did you do with it? And so that judgment day is going to happen. So this video is really cool because it was just a video of the judgment day. And so what happens is, this one guy calls this other guy and he says, I called you Evangelist John. And John's like, no, I'm an accountant. Like, I didn't run a church, like wrong person. He's like, no, I had called you to be an evangelist. And then what did you do with and he gave a number, it was like 125,000 souls that you were supposed to bring to me. And John's like, no, I was just an accountant. I ran that. I helped my church out. Like I did all those different things. But he's like, no. And if you would have sought me, I would have told you. I would have revealed it to you that this is what your purpose was going to be.
That's good.
So you have that one. Then his other guy, and then it's funny, he's like, accountant Steve. And Steve's like, no, I lead a church of 300 people. I'm a minister. I'm not an accountant. It's like, no, I called you to start an accounting company and partner with 2 other people. What did you do with the 2 million souls that would have been saved if you would have went through that calling? And so you have this minister that was supposed to do this. And so it's just this powerful thing. And John Bevere, I think I'm saying his last name wrong, but John Bevere, like he wrote a whole book on all this, and it was super powerful. And he tells the story that he was speaking at a conference, and there was a lady who pastored, whether you believe ladies should be pastors or not, that's a whole other conversation. Lady who pastored a church of thousands of people. And he spoke on that, and she was furious because she had gotten a calling when she was younger that she was supposed to go to the Philippines and minister there. And so essentially what she was saying is like, well, if what you're saying is true, that we're supposed to like go towards our purpose and calling, then me doing this church and ministering thousands of people, I'm going to get to the judgment day and be told that, you know, I was doing something wrong. And so she was furious. She was mad, which I can understand why. Like, you build a church of thousands of people. It's insane. But then he gets a message literally weeks later. I think it was like, maybe actually it was like a year later. She had stepped down from being a pastor of the church, and she was now in the Philippines doing what she was supposed to be doing. And so it's just this thing of like, we are called to something.
Yeah.
So seeking first, prayer, community, right? Because you have to seek Christ first to figure out what is that calling. It's not going to all get revealed at the same time of like, hey, you're supposed to go and do this. But if we actually listen and we seek it, we're going to figure out like, okay, cool, this is what God's designed me for.
Yeah.
And it's not always going to be big either, right? It might be, you might be called to be a father or a mother to your two kids, and that's what you're supposed to do. That's like, that's your purpose. Or it may be something like to ministry, or it may be to business, but like there's a calling. And if we don't go towards it, I think that's like one of the biggest things, that there's righteous fear in that. It's like, what happens when you get to the judgment day and you realize that you didn't do what you're supposed to do?
That's good. What do you feel like happens if you don't, you don't hear, for those listening, I got the quotes going on. What if you don't hear that calling or that purpose?
I think you don't have to make it that complicated.
Yeah,
right?
good.
Like, I think there's natural inclinations that we have of what we're good at. There are things that you hear other people whisper to you as you're growing up. And I think that's the first thing you have to realize, like, it's not always ministry.
Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of people feel like, oh, I'm not doing my purpose in the kingdom because I'm not in the church, or I don't work for the church, or I don't do stuff like that.
Oh, your life's a ministry.
But your life's a ministry. So it's like, it's those little things,
That's good.
right? Is there a certain talent that you have? Is there something that you love to absolutely do? That could be homemaking. That could be serving people. That could be building a home to where you come over and like you're feeding people. Like, there's so many different things that it could be, but it's like, it has to be like, what do you feel like you're called to? And like, for me, it was always, well, I hated school. I always rebelled. I never wanted a job, never have had a real job. I was always like a little bit more called to just like be a little bit more creative. And so it's like, man, I'm called to the marketplace. Like, I'm called to start businesses. I'm called to like lead teams. Like, that's, sales is a very, passionate skill set of mine. And so it's like, that's where I feel like my ministry is. And so like, but looking at where those gifts that you have, that's usually a correlation to like, okay, where's God calling you to?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I think sometimes we try to make it this big thing, and we're like, oh, I have to go, lead this group, or I need to go feed the homeless because it's mission work, right? But our mission work can be taken in our workplace. I mean, it can be something as you can be an accountant and you can still be in ministry, because you take your mission to your workplace. You grow your kingdom in your workplace. So I think that's really good. Yeah.
And I think it's, it's kind of put in a little bit of like, business knowledge. I think something that's really cool in entrepreneurship that a lot of people make the mistake of is that they sit around and they think they have to think of the big idea and come up with the next Amazon.
Yeah.
But in reality, all business is, it's stepping stones. And so it's taking one thing. You mentioned this in the beginning of the podcast. You're going to learn something from that experience, and it's going to lead up to the next one. Let's talk about, you talked about the story of Joseph. And you had sent me a video about that, like finding purpose and like using, explain the story of Joseph. But talk about that. Like, Joseph didn't go, I got a vision from God, I know my calling. And then the next day he was second in command to Pharaoh. You want to paint that story, or you want me to?
No, you're doing great. Keep going.
So what happens, right, is Joseph first gets a calling. And at first it's really selfish, right? Because he's just thinking of, oh man, like my family's going to bow down to me. And then he gets another vision, Same thing. He literally calls his family together to have a meeting, like a family meeting of like, hey, this is my vision. You guys are all gonna like bow down to me and serve me, right? And so that's what he's thinking his calling is.
Mhm.
And so it's so interesting how God didn't reveal it all to him at once. And it didn't
Yeah.
happen at once,
Yeah.
right? And then it goes, what, 10 years plus, maybe more than that, of him going in between slavery, prison,
Mhm.
all these different things before he even starts to see what he was supposed to do. Now, the crazy part of it, where it goes deeper in Joseph's story, is that everyone looks at Joseph's story and was like, oh man, that's awesome. Like, he went to his calling, his purpose, and he was second in command of Pharaoh in Egypt, and like this powerful person. And then his family comes and they eventually do kind of bow down to him in a sense. But people don't actually realize that Joseph's vision and his calling wasn't to him, it was to his brother,
Mhm.
because his brother was the family line that Jesus comes from.
Yeah.
And so that's why Joseph was supposed to go and do what he did, not so that Joseph could become powerful and become like, second in command in Egypt. It was actually for his brother.
Mm.
And so if God would have just came in the beginning and would have told him like, hey, you're going to have to go through all this stuff. I'm going to have you do this. You're going to go through slavery. You're going to go through prison. Like, you're going to have to do all these different things. And it's so that way you can serve your brother, so your brother can have the
Yeah.
future savior of the world. He probably wouldn't have done it.
No, definitely not.
Right. And so I think that's why it's not about necessarily figuring out what your talent is, figuring out what your gift is, so you can start operating in your gift.
Mhm.
But when you start operating your gift, you're not going to have the game plan of like, this is what the next 10 years look like.
Yeah.
Right. Like, we still don't. Like, we don't know what it's going to look like. But I feel like now it's fun because we do know what our gifts are.
What are my gifts?
You tell me.
Just curious what you had on top of your head.
You're not good at cooking. That's definitely not one of your gifts.
Hey, I've gotten way better at cooking, thank you.
So.
I make really good drumsticks, and the girls love them. That's the only chicken Harley will eat.
No, you have a gift of teaching,
Yeah.
right? There's a gift of leadership there, which is why I think it's really cool, like how our gifts kind of entwine with each other and how we can do business together because of where we kind of see God leading us in those purposes.
Yeah. And I feel like you're really good at painting a picture and having that vision and then that leadership aspect. So then and creativity, really. So, I mean, you can really take and give that vision, give that big picture, and then I can come in and help execute it.
Absolutely. So, I think we answered the question of what do you do when you're feeling purposeless? You want to sum it up?
Yeah, there's hope. But the biggest thing is to set your foundations and get in community, set your foundations, and be intimate with the Lord. It's going to look different for everybody, but just start reading your Bible, learning the stories. It is our map, it is our guide to how we're supposed to survive in this world. And so to start getting creative in the stories and understanding them differently. And just pray to the Lord, talk to the Lord, and He'll reveal it to you over time. And I think just like keep trying, right? It's not like you can't do it all on your own, but you got to take action somewhere. And so just like write down your skill sets, find what you really enjoy, find your passions, and then start trying things in those areas. And let the Lord reveal that to you.
I think the ugly truth of like, if we were to put like a stamp on it, like the last part that needs to happen, because like you said, you seek God first, you pray, you get community. Next thing you're going to start kind of figure out like what you're supposed to do. And if you're still not there, then look at what are your talents, like what do you feel called to, what were you told as a kid, like, hey, you're going to be good at this, those type of things. I think the last thing that matters is probably the hardest, because it requires pain and suffering, is that you're probably going to have to sacrifice to move into your gift.
That's good.
Right? Like that might be, for example, we sacrificed a lot of income for you to quit my company.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because we had to replace that, right? I had to like hire someone else and take what we were paying you and give it to someone else that was not a part of our family. So like our household lost that income.
Yeah.
And that was sacrifice. Right?
Yeah. And there's fear in sacrifice too.
Absolutely. To literally cut your pay down to zero, right, is no matter how financially well off, it's like that's a sacrifice that you might have to make. Right? And you see that all the time. You see the mom or the dad who feels called to like, hey, I'm supposed to be a homemaker. Okay, that means that we're gonna have to change our lifestyle, right? Because we're about to cut an income down. But if you feel like that's your calling and that's your gift, you can choose to live by the world and be afraid of the sacrifice, or you can choose to trust in God that He's calling you there, right? And then you can go for it. So I think it's that awkward thing and that just realization, like look at every story in the Bible, even Moses, Joseph, Abraham, the Israelites 40 years to get to, get to the promised land. Like there is no like I found my purpose and then it's successful the next day.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that means that once you do figure out what your purpose is, this is where you have to make a choice of like, what are you going to do? Are you going to risk getting to the judgment seat?
Yep.
Right? Where are you going to hear, well done, my good and faithful servant? Or are you going to be the person with like the story of the talents where like you didn't take your gift and use it, and then you're going to be called wicked and lazy servant?
Yeah.
Right? You're still a servant. You're still in heaven, but it's like, which one do you want to be?
Yeah.
And so if you want to be the one that's the well done, good and faithful servant, it means that you're actually going to have to step out on it, which means you're going to have to take some risk. You're probably going to have to sacrifice. Someone's probably going to call you crazy. People won't understand, but you still have to step out and actually do it if you want to actually see the fruits of living in your gift and your purpose.
Yeah, that's so good. It's not this like shiny sunshine and rainbows thing, but there are fruits in it. But you have to have that sacrifice first. That's so good.
Yeah. And cool. We'll see if it pays off for us.
We're still in the works. We're still figuring it out, right?
All right. Well, that's it, guys. We'll cut it there for this podcast. Always good having you on. Hit that. Do we do like the whole hit the subscribe button thing? We never do that. Whatever. If you like this stuff and you want to see
Hey,
more
Mom,
of it,
please subscribe, Mom.
Wendy, if you're watching this, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. I think she already did. So, all right. With that being said, let's call it a day. Bye.
Bye.